Christopher Craig was 16 years old. He owned more than 40 guns. He had spent that afternoon at the cinema with his girlfriend, watching a film about a man who is hanged for a crime he didn't commit. That night, he planned to break into a warehouse with his friend, Derek Bentley. Derek Bentley was 19. He had the reading age of a child. He had epilepsy. He had spent years in an approved school after a minor theft conviction, where staff described him as cheerful, easily led, and functioning at the mental level of an 11-year-old. He was not a violent man. He had never owned a weapon in his life. On the night of November the 2nd, 1952, these two young men climbed over a 6-foot iron gate in Croydon, South London, and made their way onto the roof of a confectionery warehouse. Craig was carrying a sawn-off revolver. Bentley was carrying a knife and a knuckle duster, both given to him by Craig. A neighbor saw them climbing the gate. She called the police. 2 police cars were dispatched. One carried Detective Constable Frederick Fairfax. The other carried a 42-year-old constable named Sidney Miles. Fairfax was the first to reach the roof. He climbed a drain pipe, identified himself as a police officer, and called out for the 2 young men to come out from behind a lift housing where they were hiding. As Fairfax approached and took hold of Bentley, restraining him, Craig raised his gun. According to the police officers present that night, Derek Bentley shouted 4 words. "Let him have it, Chris." Craig fired. The bullet struck Fairfax in the shoulder. Despite his injury, Fairfax held on to Bentley and did not let him go. More officers climbed onto the roof. Constable Sidney Miles was the first to appear. He was shot once in the head and killed instantly. Craig kept firing until he ran out of ammunition. Then he leapt 30 feet off the roof onto a greenhouse below, fracturing his spine and his wrist. He was arrested where he landed. Derek Bentley had been under arrest, held by a police officer, for the entire gun battle. He never touched the knife or the knuckle duster in his pockets. He made no attempt to run. When it was over, he was charged, alongside Craig, with the murder of Constable Sidney Miles. The case rested on 4 words. Did Derek Bentley shout, "Let him have it, Chris," as an instruction to shoot the police officer? Or did he shout it as a plea to hand the gun over, to give it up, to stop? Both Bentley and Craig denied that the words were ever said at all. One of the police officers present that night, Constable Claude Payne, would later say that he never heard Bentley say anything of the sort. His account was not used at trial. The trial began on December the 9th, 1952, at the Old Bailey in London, in front of the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Goddard. It lasted 3 days. At the time, the law of England and Wales held that murder carried a mandatory death sentence. There was no judicial discretion. If you were found guilty of murder, you were sentenced to hang, regardless of age, regardless of intent, regardless of who actually pulled the trigger. Christopher Craig had fired the gun. Christopher Craig had killed Constable Miles. But Christopher Craig was 16 years old, too young under English law to be executed. He would be sentenced instead to detention at Her Majesty's pleasure. Derek Bentley was 19, old enough to hang. The prosecution's case against Bentley relied on a legal principle called joint enterprise. The argument was this: Bentley and Craig had entered the warehouse together, armed, with a shared understanding that they might need to resist arrest. Under that principle, if the jury believed Bentley had encouraged Craig, even with 4 ambiguous words, even while restrained by a police officer, he could be held equally responsible for the killing, as though he had fired the shot himself. The defense argued that there was no joint agreement to use violence against the police, and that Bentley, under arrest and unarmed in his actions, could not reasonably be held responsible for what Craig did next. Bentley's intellectual disability was raised at trial. He had a verbal IQ of 71, a reading age of 4 years and 6 months. He had been examined twice by EEG, once showing signs of epilepsy, once described simply as abnormal. None of this changed the legal question the jury was asked to answer. None of it was explained to them in a way that mattered. The Lord Chief Justice's summing up to the jury has been criticized for decades since. Some legal historians believe he all but instructed them toward a guilty verdict, describing Bentley as mentally aiding the murder, despite Bentley never raising a weapon, never resisting arrest, and never being free to act independently at any point during the shooting. The jury deliberated for 75 minutes. They found both Craig and Bentley guilty of murder. They added a recommendation: mercy for Bentley. The judge sentenced him to death anyway. English law at the time gave him no other option once the verdict was returned. Christopher Craig, the boy who shot and killed a police officer, was sent to a juvenile detention facility. He would serve 10 years, marry, and become a plumber. Derek Bentley, the boy who never fired a shot, who was under arrest the entire time, who could not read past a child's level, was sentenced to die. His lawyers appealed. They argued the ballistic evidence was inconclusive. The fatal bullet was never even recovered, and Craig's ammunition was so badly undersized for the gun that accuracy beyond 6 feet was questionable at best. They argued the phrase, "let him have it," was genuinely ambiguous and should never have been treated as a command to kill. They argued that Bentley's mental age made the entire legal theory of complicity unsound. The appeal was rejected on January 13th, 1953. Derek Bentley's life was now in the hands of one man, the Home Secretary, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe. Only he could recommend that the Crown exercise its prerogative of mercy and commute the sentence to life imprisonment. 200 members of Parliament signed a memorandum urging exactly that. Public outrage was growing by the day. The idea that a boy with the mental age of 11 would be hanged for words he may never have said, while the boy who actually fired the gun walked free in a few years, struck much of Britain as obscene. Maxwell Fyfe refused. On the morning of January the 28th, 1953, the door to Derek Bentley's cell at Wandsworth Prison opened. He was offered a glass of brandy. He was walked to the execution chamber. His arms were bound. A white linen hood was placed over his head. A noose was placed around his neck. The executioner was a man named Albert Pierre Point, one of the most prolific hangmen in British history. At a few minutes before 9 o'clock, the trapdoor opened. Derek Bentley was pronounced dead. He was 19 years old. Outside the prison gates, a crowd of around 5,000 people had gathered. When the official notice of execution was posted, some of them tore it down and burned it. 2 people were arrested for damage to property. It was, by any measure, one of the most publicly contested executions in 20th century Britain. Christopher Craig was released from prison in May 1963. He married. He worked as a plumber for the rest of his life. He rarely spoke publicly about what had happened on that rooftop, or about the friend who died in his place, for words that may never have been spoken at all. Derek Bentley's family did not stop fighting. His sister, Iris Bentley, spent the rest of her life campaigning to have her brother's name cleared. She wrote letters. She gave interviews. She refused to let the case fade into history as a regrettable footnote. She would not live to see it resolved. In 1998, 45 years after Derek Bentley was hanged, the Court of Appeal finally quashed his conviction. The judges ruled that the trial judge had failed to properly direct the jury on the question of whether Bentley remained part of any joint enterprise once he was under arrest and physically restrained by police. They found that the summing up to the jury had been seriously flawed. Derek Bentley was, at last, no longer a convicted murderer in the eyes of English law. Iris Bentley had died just months before the ruling. She never heard the words she had spent 45 years fighting for. In 1993, before the conviction was formally overturned, Derek Bentley had already received a posthumous royal pardon for his death sentence. In its broadest and most punishing form, remained part of English law for decades after his death. It was not significantly narrowed until 2016, when the UK Supreme Court ruled that the version of joint enterprise used in cases like Bentley's had taken, in the court's own words, a wrong turn more than 60 years earlier. Derek Bentley was the first person in English legal history to be executed as an accomplice to a murder for a crime committed by someone who could not, themselves, be executed for it. He spoke 4 words on a rooftop in Croydon, words that 2 other people who were there say he never said at all, words that, even if he did say them, could just as easily have meant, please, stop, give him the gun, as they could have meant anything else. For those 4 words, contested then and contested now, Derek Bentley was hanged. The boy who pulled the trigger lived a long, quiet life as a plumber in London. If you find these stories of justice, injustice, and the systems that get it wrong as compelling as I do, consider subscribing to the channel. Every week, we uncover another case the world has forgotten, and the people who paid the price for it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.